EU, if you want to understand it well, you need to go back to the beginnings. And it started at the ashes of the Second World War in Europe. It was envisaged as first and foremost, a peace project, a project that will economically connect Europe so that never again we can see the type of destruction that Europe has brought on itself during the world wars. Europe, in many ways, depended very much on the US. I could even say we outsourced our security almost to the US. There is this famous video from the first Trump presidency when he's in the UN and talking about how the European countries in particular, I think he was talking about Germany, how little they invest in defense, how they are fully dependent on Russian energy sources. There's a video, the German diplomats are laughing in this video, but he was right. And I think President Trump, with his very brutal realpolitik style, offers an opportunity for Europe, exactly to become more strategically autonomous.
Today I have with me Dean Mato Njavro from the heart of Europe, from Croatia, joining me on today's podcast. We'll be talking about the future of Europe. What does it mean for Europe to thrive in a multipolar world? What we actually can learn from Europe, and maybe some of the challenges facing Europe today. So it is with my great privilege that I get to welcome Dean Mato on. Dean, welcome.
Hi, Keith. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're the Dean of the Zagreb School of Economics, and you're in Croatia. You're the last member country to join the EU in 2013. So ever since then, there's been no country that's joined. And that was actually, I think, Croatia joined in what many people call the crisis years, the post-08 financial crisis. There was a fallout then.
Correct.
I wanted to ask you, what kept Croatia optimistic about the European project that they continued with the accession project?
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. Look, in 2013, Croatia joined officially the European Union. Last year, we finished that integration. We joined also the Schengen, and now we are also a member of the Eurozone. And the reason why we joined the European Union is quite simple. Actually, almost all of these Central Eastern European countries, whether it's Croatia, whether it's Poland, Czech Republic, all of them that became independent after the fall of the Berlin Wall were deeply the population felt deeply European, and there was a sense that their destiny is as members of the European Union. Unlike our friends in Poland and Czech Republic, Croatia had a pretty, I would say, difficult years in the 90s. So the country has been independent, as I said, only since the beginning of 90s. And unlike our friends in other parts of Central Eastern Europe, we had to fight for our independence in a pretty brutal war. However, there was always a sense among our population, there was a sense among our leadership that Croatia's destiny is inside of Europe. So ever since the country became independent, the political elites, together with the people, were working hard to join the European Union. So the point I want to make is the EU still has quite a lot of attraction for all these, let's say, smaller countries, such as Croatia, such as even those that are not yet members of the European Union. So let's say beginning of this year, Romania and Bulgaria joined Schengen. So the European Commission put out that really nice video on their website showing how, Europe is blue all the way from Lisbon, and you can drive, all the way from Lisbon, 3,500 kilometers to Bucharest in Romania. It's all part of this Schengen zone. Schengen zone, for our viewers who might know, is this basically one single area where if you're a Croatian or if you're Romanian now, or if you're Polish or French or Italian, whenever you go visit another country, you don't need any documents. So it's basically a borderless area. However, to this day, the European project has gone and has, I would say, developed very well. It has integrated many countries. Now we have 27 EU countries, but the integration is not finished. So if you look at the video that I was talking about by the EU Commission, Europe is blue all the way from Lisbon to Bucharest, then Greece, but then in the middle of Europe, very close to our region, my region, Croatia, there's still like a dark gray hole on this video. So the countries that have not yet joined the EU. So this is but all of those countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, they're in the process. So the EU, for a European country such as Croatia, was instrumental. Why? I remember well the days I just started with the elementary school in the 90s, as the war was starting to break out. The 90s were tough for Croatia. We ultimately became independent, and as we started the process of joining the EU, the country started changing a lot. The country started transforming. So the infrastructure, we built the roads, the beautiful road network. We built airports, new ports. So none of that would have been possible really without this integration with Euro. So today, if you go to Croatia, you land at a beautiful airport in the city of Zagreb. If you want to go to the most famous city in Croatia, probably Dubrovnik, a jewel of the Adriatic, you rent a car in Zagreb, you drive 700 kilometers all the way down south on a beautiful road. Then you come, you cross a beautiful bridge before entering Dubrovnik. So my point is, the country has transformed itself. Infrastructure has been significantly upgraded. The entrepreneurial ecosystem has developed, and without the EU membership, it would have been difficult to envisage all of this transformation.
Well, there's a contrast there, because in ASEAN, the challenge has always been, and this is something that I think Gita Wijayan makes a critique of, is that we shake a lot of hands, we smile a lot, but nothing really gets done, in the sense that, the poorer countries don't get the kind of lift from the richer countries, or there is no kind of developmental support.
So in EU, I'm aware of that. ASEAN is much lighter.
Yeah.
I would say less ambitious, maybe a project than the EU. The EU, if you want to understand it well, you need to go back to the beginnings, and it started at the ashes of the of the Second World War in Europe. It was envisaged as first and foremost a peace project, a project that will economically connect Europe, so that never again we can see the type of destruction that Europe has brought on itself during the world wars. And in that sense, it was an extremely ambitious project.
Yes.
It evolved into something today that is a very unique animal, so to say. It is an entity that contains basically 27 countries. It is an entity that has made many successful projects, such as the one that I mentioned, let's say Schengen, such as the fact that euro as a currency has really become one of the, after the US dollar, one of the leading reserve currencies of the world. Without the European Union, there would be no euro. So without euro, Europe would not be a united entity. So it has, I'm the dean of, as you said, Zagreb School of Economics and Management. All my students are very familiar with one of the most popular projects that was created as a result of the EU, which is the so-called Erasmus project, which essentially enables any one of European students, wherever they study, whether it be it in France, Italy, Spain, Croatia, or Poland, that during their period of studying, they can spend a semester at any other European institution, at any other country, and that semester is financially supported by the European Commission. So it makes it easier for people to kind of create their second identity. In Europe, we all have at least two identities. Your first identity is your country, but the second identity that Erasmus program has helped building is this European identity. So my students, when they they're Croatian, but when they go to Rome in Italy, when they go to Berlin or Paris, they feel like almost like at home, and that was the point of this Erasmus project, and it was a massively successful project. But having said all that, yes, you're right. There's still many unfinished jobs. There is Europe is an unfinished project, both in terms of integration. There's still countries that need to be integrated, and also there's many other challenges as the world is changing. That I'm sure we'll talk about it as we progress.
The follow-on question I had was maybe want to do with like the spirit or the core of it, which is that you kind of alluded to earlier that even as a Croatian before joining the EU, there is a strong affinity for this European identity. Where do you think that springs from?
It springs from let's say our common history that we share. That Croatia as an independent country exists only since for the last 35 years. Before that, we were kind of part of various different let's say countries or empires. First it was the former Yugoslavia, but before that, large part of Croatia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this sense that we share the common destiny with our European neighbors, whether it's Italy, whether it's Austria or Germany or France, it just stems from the fact that historically we have always been close to them. Geographically, we are practically in the heart of Europe. If you look at Europe, we're in the heart of it. But everything I say for Croatia, you can apply it to any other Central European country. So there's just a common sense of destiny that European countries share when it comes to their will to be part of the European Union. Yeah, I think that's somehow there's a consensus among the population. There's no way else for us to go. We are simply Europe. We are.
When you have a 27 countries in a union, is that there's a lot of trade-offs that you have to make, maybe at a governance level, and I think you're very familiar with that. A good example is like one of the big challenges that I think that Europe has faced in the past decade is the issue of immigration, right? Or maybe the refugee crisis, some will call it, is that when you have a Schengen, different countries might have different policies, but because of this borderless approach towards managing kind of human flows, you might face the spillover effects of another country's policies. How do you see that challenge kind of creating tensions within the EU today?
Immigration was and certainly still is a massive issue, not just in Europe. I would say it's been kind of the genie's out of the bottle on that one. So it's a big issue, as we can see in the US, but in Europe also. Look, Europe today, if you look at it as an entity, is one of the, with all our challenges and issues that we face, it's still one of the most developed places in the world, where the standard of living is the highest. EU countries are among the richest in the world, GDP per capita. And if you look at the geography, on the south we have, there's Africa. On the southeast, the Middle East, there's simply, there's hundreds of millions of people living in much poorer conditions than Europe. And for many of them, Europe is kind of the place where they want to go, because it is where they see their the better future for their families. Croatia, obviously being the part of the EU, has been one of these transit zones where many of the immigrants, for instance, after the Arab Spring, after the troubles, and after the, I would say, ill-conceived attempts to destabilize countries, let's say in the Northern Africa and the Middle East, whether it's Libya, whether it's Syria, there's been a tremendous pressure of immigrants to Europe. Many of them were crossing through Croatia, but Croatia was not their final destination, because they were set to go to other places such as Germany, such as Scandinavia. It is a problem that no single country actually in Europe can, I would say, solve. It is a problem that has to be solved at a level of the European Union, at the level of EU Commission. And it is really a problem that if you really want to be serious about it, and if you want to solve it, you have to start basically at the source. So if you think about it, look, Africa in 2050 will have almost 2.5 billion people.
Yeah.
Okay, 1 in 4 person in the world will be African. I'm talking about the whole continent of Africa. EU has 450 million people. If Europe somehow doesn't engage itself with Africa and starts developing Africa, starts building up on a massive scale, or helping build Africa, there will be a tremendous pressure of future immigrants from Africa to Europe. Can Europe do it by itself? Probably not. Who is very active already doing these things in Africa? It's China. So one of the things where, and we'll talk later about China, but one of the ways to try to combat this future issue of immigration is to try to see what we can do as Europeans at the source and trying to develop or help develop African countries so that there's more opportunity there, so that they don't feel obliged to try to come to Europe. So the issue of immigration, look, it's a huge thing. It's every country in Europe has their own, let's say,
Yeah.
some have more, some have less problems with that. Today, countries like Germany, France, there's a big pushback, UK, big pushback on this type of illegal immigration. We're talking about illegal immigration, so people coming outside of Europe to Europe. We're not talking about, inter-Schengen movements, because if somebody moves from Croatia to Germany, that's not gonna tilt the scale. Usually, that's not a problem. But when 1 million refugees come from Syria and Libya, then that's a problem. And there's a lot of pushback on that. And this is the reason also why many parties have also been political parties have been making a strong case on why putting immigration at the center, and this resonates with quite a lot of voters. So in countries like Germany, in countries like France, you have very strong anti-establishment parties who are putting immigration at the core.
If you use the immigration issue as an example, the follow-on thinking or the consequence would be then, people within Europe might be disillusioned of the EU project altogether, because what you're experiencing at that level is a form of spillover effects. And like the financial crisis is another good example, post 08, where it's, some countries might feel that I'm giving up a certain level of autonomy for integration, and that's the trade-off. Because in Southeast Asia, it's the reverse. It's you keep all your autonomy, but you have very little integration, right? So my question to you is then, do you think there is now greater disillusionment with the EU project in general, or does it still remain strong as something that people are as optimistic as you are today?
I would say certainly the countries that have joined EU towards the end, such as Croatia, such as Poland, such as Czech Republic, those countries have benefited a lot over the, let's say, last 2 or 3 decades, 2 decades. And those countries, the population of those countries still share a very pro-European sentiment. It is also those countries that have not suffered from a huge amount of illegal immigration, because those countries were the transit countries. So generally the let's say the illegal immigrants, they didn't end up in Poland or in Croatia. They went to Germany. Many of them went to France, some to Italy. So there is this, the Central Eastern European bloc is still very much pro-Europe. But I would argue that even, the core European countries, the ones that were there from the start, I don't know, Germany, Italy, France. In Italy, okay, currently in power, we have Prime Minister Meloni, who is kind of on the right spectrum of on the right side of the political spectrum. Even though she was also the one that put the issue of immigration at the core of her, let's say, at the core of her political efforts to try to, in a way, find a solution to that problem. Once she became the prime minister, she never questioned really Italy's role or place within the EU. So my sense is, especially given how the world is developing and we're going to some kind of a multipolar world, there is a understanding in Europe among almost all major European countries that there's no alternative to EU. If we are divided, then in this world of big superpowers, any European country alone is almost irrelevant, even the strongest one, Germany or France. Only if we are together, united under the EU umbrella, we have some chance of, managing through these challenging times that we are having, and that certainly in the future we're going to have more of. So my point is, look, there is, I think, if I had to generalize, across Europe, there are many challenges and issues, immigration certainly being one of them. But whether people or our elites or our leadership is questioning whether the EU itself should exist, I think that is not the case. There's a strong support for EU because with all our challenges so far, EU has been a success project.
A stabilizer.
Now, a stabilizer. Now, could it have developed faster? Could it have done more to kind of adjust to the new world realities? Certainly, but it's still been a major success project. Yeah.
The whole Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah.
Like we're starting to see that within EU, there's been certain divergent modes of thinking, right?
Yes.
I wanted to ask maybe specific on that question, which is, when you look at what's happening in Ukraine from your perspective as someone in the heart of Europe.
And most of the European leaders, as well as the EU as a whole, has wholeheartedly helped Ukraine as much as, I would say, as much as EU could have done. So both in terms of financial support, weapons, in terms of opening up and making it easy for refugees from Ukraine to find a temporary home. Some countries like Poland have taken a lot of Ukrainian refugees. Croatia has taken some. However, there's not among the European leaders. There's not a singular. There's not a singular consensus on that. So there, as you probably know, there's more and more voices, such as let's say, Hungary is an example, Slovakia is an example, where they are questioning the orthodoxy on this particular issue. So it's not there's no consensus in that sense, but most of the European leaders have wholeheartedly been helping Ukraine. But this is the war, obviously, this is certainly the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War. Before this war, the biggest war was in my neighborhood, or actually in my country and the neighborhood, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now this is overshadowed by the massive Russian-Ukraine war, and it's obviously it's a huge problem for Europe, actually, because while we're not directly in war. Obviously, it's the Ukrainians who are doing all the heavy lifting and fighting heroically. They've achieved. It's absolutely impressive what they have managed to achieve, and how they have managed to defend themselves. But indirectly, Europe is essentially, as I said, not directly in war, but indirectly it's supporting Ukraine, and it's a big problem for Europe, actually, because a lot of our efforts, a lot of our resources are going towards this war that does not seem to be ending, right? That is just seems to be a kind of a long, protracted war of attrition, and it's a huge problem for Europe. And I would say even in the countries where there is total support for Ukraine, like let's say among the top elites, the parties, there are some political parties that are gaining more traction, that war should be kind of brought to an end at almost any cost. So it's a huge problem for Europe. Yes. Absolutely, yeah.
Because you're investing a lot. You're essentially spending a lot of resources, right?
Absolutely. Europe is rearming. Brussels is in many ways preparing for war. So it's a situation unlike anything that I've seen since I've been maybe in the last probably 3 decades. Yeah.
Do you think that peace can be achieved?
As I started going into elementary school, I remembered we had to go at some point. My city was being bombarded, so we had to go into the shelters. So I'm somebody who is old enough to be able to remember what war looks like, and having that experience, it's something that makes you sympathize, obviously, with the Ukrainians, but it's also something that makes you want to do anything you can to stop the war. The war will eventually. All wars ultimately come to an end. It's just a matter of time and lives and energy that needs to be kind of expanded to bring it to the end. So eventually, yes, the war will end. There is a certain sense of, fatigue in Europe, probably also in Ukraine. There is great initiative by the current president of the U.S., Trump, that is trying his best to kind of bring the war to an end. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. There's nobody really has a crystal ball, but there is a sense and a desire to help end this war as soon as possible. Yeah.
Okay. So there's been a shift, at least in the past. It was just kind of, at least you would say that in the past there wasn't that kind of like end in sight, but now it's like increasingly more and more leaders are like, we have to push for an end in
I
sight.
would say so. Yeah. Yeah.
There is a point that you made earlier about President Trump, and this is where like there's been some form of criticisms, I think, in American media or like Western media that the EU has been, or European leaders have kind of been engaging in some form of, they call it, this is from Susan Glasser
Mhm.
from the New Yorker. She says that it's a strategic self-abasement. So she was referring to, I think, Mark Rutte, which is the NATO SecGen, when he called like President Trump Daddy Trump, for example.
Yeah.
And implicit, I think, in that critique is that the West has pretty much hitched its carriage too much on the horse of the US, meaning that maybe there was too much of an ideological convergence that Europeans didn't really act in much of their own interests. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
I think to a certain extent it's a fair criticism in the sense that, Europe in many ways depended very much on the US. I could even say, some parts of we outsourced our security almost to the US. There is this famous, video from the first Trump presidency when he's in the UN and talking about how the European countries, in particular, I think he was talking about Germany, how little they invest in defense, how they are fully dependent on Russian energy sources. And there's a video, the German diplomats are laughing in this video, but he was right. And I think President Trump, with his very brutal realpolitik style, offers an opportunity for Europe exactly to become more strategically autonomous. I hope our leaders will be able to kind of take this opportunity and start making decisions and start making policies that put Europe first, right? Because sometimes we share interests with our American partners, but many times, our interests are not maybe aligned. So the fact that President Trump is, offering to disengage from many of the European, let's say, matters, might offer an opportunity for Europe to become more self-reliant, to become more strategically autonomous. This is something I hope that Europe and European leaders will be able to jump on and take this advantage. So, because yes, I agree with you that sometimes, you look at some of our policies and, you think, oh, where's Europe in this? Does it really make sense?
What are some examples that in your mind in the past you feel like, hey, this wasn't a really kind of Europe first kind of policies?
One example is Europe has really and is certainly a global leader in let's say environmental and green, let's say, not technologies, but the desire to be the cleanest, environmentally friendly adopter. Yeah. So much so that let's say the rules adopted by the EU Commission were so strict that it went against the European industry many times, and without really acknowledging the fact that if you're really serious about environmental preservation, this is not a problem that any single country can solve itself, right? It's a problem that it's a global issue, has to be solved at the multilateral level. You have to engage with, US, but also China, India, and so. But in case of the Commission, they really adopted such high standards that it put a lot of pressure on the industry, making it more difficult to be competitive. So this is, let's say, one example. Another example is generally our security arrangement, with our neighbors, however this war ends in Russia, in Ukraine, Russia's not going to go away.
Yeah.
Geographically, it will stay there. So there's going to be, Europe will have to find some kind of equilibrium again with Russia. So, hopefully, I hope European leaders will be able to find that new equilibrium. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you're saying is like, if you're a European leader, it's kind of maybe not right to kind of bash Russia all the time like the Americans do, for example, because they're your neighbor. So
I mean,
you need to take that into consideration.
they're not going to go away. We've imposed. I think Russia is currently the most sanctioned country in the world by far.
Yeah.
These sanctions have not really done what the originators of the sanctions hoped they would. They have not collapsed Russia economically. Russia is sometimes you just have to look at the map geographically. It's not going to go away. It's going to be there. So there's going to have to be some new equilibrium with Russia. So it's not one key thing I'd like to, and I'm going to give you an example. In the 90s, there was a war not only in Croatia, but there was a war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, our neighboring countries. And initially, Europe thought that this is our neighborhood. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a relatively small country. This is something that we will be able to deal with ourselves. So we don't, the thinking at the time among the European leaders was we don't need Americans' help to deal with it. Ultimately, what happened is after few years, Americans came in. After Europe couldn't fix its own problems, Americans came in, brought the leaders of Bosnia and Herzegovina to Dayton, to the U.S., and they were the one who brokered the Dayton peace agreement that was the basis of today's modern Bosnia and Herzegovina, basically the constitution. Why am I telling you this? Because if the same thing happens again, that means that Europe will not be at the table when the peace between Ukraine and Russia will be signed. We don't want the situation where other entities, other countries like the US is doing it again for Europeans. So there's going to have to, like, for Europe, it's much better that it takes part in this process than that the US brokers it without anyone from Europe sitting at the table, which is a true risk.
One might wonder, after the 2008 financial crisis, you look at the European countries that were the worst affected, a lot of them were actually kind of followed the US trend of deregulating the financial sector a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that would be the moment for Europeans to kind of like for Europe, EU in general, to say, hey, we should be much more kind of autonomous. Do you think that that's actually a fair criticism that, that was actually not, like, that actually was I wouldn't say the wrong time, but maybe, do you think it's a fair criticism that people made, which is because you follow the West too much, you now had, to a certain extent, a huge contagion from the financial crisis that originated in the US?
Europe and US, both, our financial systems are intertwined and connected. Unlike, for instance, at the time, China, and still today, China's financial system is quite, well, maybe isolated from the, China protects its own financial system, and therefore during the 2008 financial crisis was not so heavily affected and could act in a different way with the massive stimulus that they have started. But simply our systems, between financial systems between Europe and US were heavily intertwined, and therefore when the trouble started, it was almost inevitable that Europe would be affected. One maybe thing that not many people today know is how the tables have turned. I remember in the 10-12 years ago, so we're talking about 2012, there was this somebody coined this acronym PIGS: Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece, as the countries that are the sick men of Europe. And this was all because they were over-leveraged, too much debt, and the global financial crisis hit them hard. Fast forward 10 years after, actually it's many of these countries that are doing the best currently in the EU in terms of economic growth, in terms of employment. So one thing that gives me hope about Europe is Europe's ability kind of to recognize the problem and then adapt. Maybe it doesn't happen very quickly, and it doesn't because of the structural, let's say, structural limitations of Europe itself. Because mind you, we always talk about Europe. I say Europe, EU, but we're talking about 27 countries that interact with European entities or bodies such as European Parliament, European Commission, where some level of sovereignty has been delegated to. And these 27 countries, together with the European bodies, need to kind of create a coherent economic or foreign policy. So, let's be kind to Europe, because it's not, it's Europe is messy. It's messy almost by design. But it's able to recognize it was able to recognize historical moments. So in 2012, after the global financial crisis, many of the institutions, were like European Stability Mechanism, like some others. These new institutions were set up in order to avoid future, let's say, issues or future global financial crises. And today the system is much more stable, much more robust. The countries that were in trouble back then, today are actually doing much better. I remember, and then on top of that, you have these fast-growing economies of my country that has been growing quite fast, of, let's say, Poland. I'll give you a story, In 2008, I was in London, working in London in a bank. And I remember at that time, if you needed a plumber or an electrician in London, they were all Polish. For some reason or another, they were all coming from Poland. I just spoke to a friend who lives in London recently, and he told me all the Polish people have gone back to Poland. It's difficult to find a Polish plumber anymore in UK because Poland has grown so much. Poland has transformed itself. It's become a kind of an economic tiger, so whereas at the same time, UK has left the EU through Brexit, as we know, and I'm not sure how good it worked out for them. The jury is still out on that one.
Kishore was making a joke there. The British have taken a holiday from EU. So it's not an exit. It's a vacation.
Vacation. That's true, because there's more now. There's again the sentiment that they want to rejoin, even though I we'll see what happens. But to go back to your question, that Europe has over time shown ability to recognize a problem and then react. And I hope that we are again in such a situation where there are many important issues. Some of them we talked about: immigration, war in Ukraine. I don't know, the whole green agenda, Green New Deal, which the European Commission is strongly supporting. Okay, let's see how Europe will, now react in order to adjust and try to solve these issues.
One thing I'm picking up from you is that, a good joke is like you can't underestimate how resilient the pigs are, or Europe is in general. Like, don't underestimate the resilience of Europe.
Yeah, it's messy by default. It's not like it's almost unfair. Europe gets sometimes compared to these other big geopolitical giants, superpowers, China, which is super homogeneous. Like we're talking about 1.3 billion people, 95% ethnic Han. You have the US, which is also certain the world's number one superpower with all its issues, but still certainly strong, and with the historical ability to kind of re-innovate itself, and this very dynamic economic system. And then you have Europe, which is a peace project of 27 countries, which is idealistic, certainly, which is super ambitious in its aim to integrate these countries into one coherent entity without infringing upon the identities, let's say, or without fully giving the sovereignty to Brussels. So it's kind of, so in that sense,
it's always a constant tension.
it's always exactly, yeah. It's always a constant tension. But again, I will make, I will repeat the point that historically it has shown the ability on many examples how it can adapt.
Yeah.
Now, it's currently facing many challenges, so my hope is that it will be able to adapt again.
You've focused your efforts on understanding China as a European as well, which is something that not many people in Europe are very passionate about. You've earlier alluded to the fact that as part of trying to manage the immigration challenge from Africa, a huge part has to do with maybe redirecting or directing foreign direct investment into Africa, and China is a huge player. But at the same time, the rise of China has been very uncomfortable for a lot of Europeans. So this is where you have someone like, the former Prime Minister of Estonia, Ms. Kallas. She was talking about the Western leaders gathering in diplomacy and autocratic alliances seeking a fast track to a new world order, referring to President Xi alongside the leaders of Russia, Iran, and North Korea in Beijing. My question to you is, do you think Europe as of today has acclimatized itself to the emergence of China?
Okay, so yeah, I'm familiar with that statement. I think it's a overly simplistic view of the world and of China, and sometimes Europe has this, or European politicians, leaders have this tendency to deliver lessons across the world of how across the world of how they think things should work, as opposed to really trying to put effort into understanding these different countries. So the rise of China has certainly been, it's one of the defining moments of, let's say, not just China, but all of Asia of this 21st century. And I would say to understand how Europe feels about it is not very easy, because it's a kind of a complex issue. So some countries, to put it very bluntly, some countries in Europe are feeling more threatened or are exhibiting more, let's say, skepticism about it. Other countries, including my own, has been more pragmatic about it, more realistic about it. Croatia there's several projects in Croatia that are quite, I would say, some flagship projects where you could have seen a great collaboration between, let's say, Chinese companies and our own companies. One example is, let's say, this famous bridge that was constructed that connects basically the south of Croatia, which was built by a Chinese company. One of the biggest, let's say, renewable wind farm in my part of Europe is also built by China. So in Croatia, there's quite a few successful projects. The port of Piraeus in Greece. There's been many Chinese investments in Europe, and what you have to keep in mind in Europe is that the Ms. Kallas, she's from the one of the European bodies, but Europe consists of 27 different countries. Each and every one of them have their own kind of view. So to make an argument that all Europe is feeling super uncomfortable about China, it would again be overly simplistic. So if we put that all aside and focus on the issues, there is hope that actually Europe, working together with China, can try to achieve many of its own interests. I told you the example about, we talked about immigration, and big source of immigration is and will be Africa. It is only natural for Europe to collaborate with China in Africa in order to help develop Africa as best as we can, because this is in our own interest. We want to develop Africa. We don't want people there who are hopeless, who are so hopeless that they will walk across the Sahara Desert, swim across the Mediterranean Ocean just to come to Europe. This is not in Europe's interest. And only together, by working together with China, who already has a strong foothold there, we can do something about it. Another example is let's say the Europe's ambitions in the green energy, let's say in sustainability. I just came back from China 2 weeks ago. I was at the Global Sustainability Summit, and Europe can achieve it, but it can achieve it quicker, faster, and more efficient if it collaborates with China. So I think we're it is in our own interest to collaborate with China to find it, as in China they like to say, a win-win solution, something that's good for Europe, something that's good for China.
Do you think that thinking is mainstream now within the EU, especially among the political leaders or business leaders?
Not yet, and I'll tell you why. Maybe not yet, and I'll tell you why. Let's say the current echelon of European leaders have all kind of come from, if you look at like their careers and if you look at how it developed, it was very Eurocentric. So this whole Europe project, EU project, it took extremely a lot of energy. It was tough. It's not easy to make it work. 27 countries with different languages, different histories, different customs, but all of them still sharing this one kind of same European destiny. It took a lot of effort to make it all work. So European leaders, over the last maybe 2 decades were really kind of involved, and most of their resources were focused on making this Europe project work. As a result of that, maybe Europe turned inwards a little bit. It maybe even, how do I say, allowed itself to be, our elite, our leadership elite was only focused on how do we make Europe work. And during that time, they stopped thinking or educating themselves about the rest of the world. So yes, I think there is currently in Europe, there's a deficit of knowledge and understanding about, let's say, the rest of the world, about Asia, about ASEAN, about China, and this is a problem. But there isn't, there's a sense that this is a problem. I'll give you an example. Recently, we had the opportunity to host at the Zagreb School of Economics and Management, Mr. Giorgio, your former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we hosted him for 2 amazing sessions, and we put the sessions online, and they're quite popular, so you can find them on YouTube. And the sessions were quickly picked up by a leading Italian newspaper, who then made a story about exactly about what we talk about how Europe needs a new generation of leaders who will not only understand Europe, okay, but who will also better understand the rest of the world. And the reason why this journalist from Italy picked up on my talk with Mr. Yo was because, as you well know, Mr. Yo is displayed really an amazing understanding of our part of the world, of Europe, of the US. And when we think about it, in Europe, maybe we had these types of leaders decades ago, but we need them again. We need them again.
So what you're saying is that currently, because there's so much mental energy really focused on making the EU project work, so in a certain sense, they had to kind of trade. There's a trade-off that was being made.
I would say kind of. Yeah, you can make that argument. Yeah, so much energy was expended on just making the EU work, because it's not easy, it's messy, it's difficult, that our leaders ultimately ended up being experts on EU, but not really understanding the rest of the world well.
And then from a business point of view, if you look at industrial policy or trade policy, there's a lot of kind of discomfort that now China's dominating in areas where the European economies were traditional players or dominant players. Like, you think about the automobiles, you think about, be it chips manufacturing, a lot of the high-end technology that was previously kind of the European wheelhouse is now kind of been won over by China. So there's this discomfort. Do you see that in Europe, that people are like, hey, China's really emerging and we should learn from them? Or is it like, oh, they're cheating, they're bad guys? What's been the thinking around this?
You're certainly right that there is and I think the COVID years during which there was kind of just travel to China stopped. People stopped going there. China kind of isolated itself for a couple of years, and then it reopened. And within those 4 years, when people from Europe started traveling back to China, they started seeing at the electric vehicle markets in China. They were like, "Wow, what is this? These cars are. I mean, this is state of the art. This is as good, if not better, than what we have in Europe." We were always, very proud of our let's say car industry. So there is this sense that China has really leapfrogged in some industries and taken advantage. Having said that, I would say Europe still has an ecosystem of research institutions, universities, innovative companies, ability to compete at the highest level, whether it's, one good example is the airline industry, Airbus, which has been doing, extremely well, probably outperforming Boeing, the American Boeing, and it shows that Europe is still capable to, produce super competitive products in very complicated industries. So Europe is happy to compete. And one thing that every European leader will tell you when they talk about China is just that there has to be this kind of, I would say, a symmetric relationship when it comes to market access. There was a kind of a sense that Europe opened itself up to China and Chinese products, but when Europeans wanted to go to China, then it was the markets were in certain areas quite protected. So there is this sense of symmetry that needs to be achieved. But Mr. Yo, when he was in Croatia, he said one interesting thing, basically that stuck with me, which is, in certain industries where China has shown dominance and such as, let's say, the new energy vehicles or electric vehicles, maybe what Europe should do is, do what China did when European car industries 20, 30 years ago were going into China, which is force them to open up joint ventures. And China did it because China wanted their companies to learn from these experiences. Maybe we should now, in a way, try to get Chinese electric vehicle companies to open up JVs in Europe in order to get market access. So but I think this is now we're talking. This is in the realms of negotiation for trade and trade deals between Europe and China. I think Europe has the ability to compete in certain sectors. China has done tremendously well, for sure, and that is, we'll have to find a way, kind of, to define our relationship in such a way that it's again win-win.
It's something that's quite fascinating as a Southeast Asian or Singaporean when you see how European leaders engage with China. It's like in Singapore, when I speak to my friends who are like diplomats and everything, it's like to them, like, this is kind of like a no. Like, some things you just don't say it out loud. So it's interesting to see that learning curve happen in real time.
Learning curve in Europe maybe did not yet happen. I hope it will, because you're right. I mean, some things that our leaders say when they go to China, it makes me blush a little bit. It's like faux pas, as the French would say. Like, you just don't do certain things. You don't go and maybe another thing I hope that our leaders will be able to do is show also some genuine intellectual curiosity and humility, and not just go and preach imposture.
And there's the example of the Ricci, right? And I think someone like Mr. Yo would always point out, which is you go there the spirit of trying to understand the other part of the world a bit more, so that you can enrich your part of the world a bit more.
Yeah, Europe had it. I mean, for centuries, Europeans were going to China with open minds and trying to learn. So we just need to kind of rediscover that.
From your perspective as someone who's in education, interacting with business leaders as well, it's like, do you think there's kind of projects or kind of initiatives at a policy level or at a EU level that can promote understanding between Europe and not just China, but Singapore, Southeast Asia, our
Right.
part of the world, where it's a bit peripheral to them.
I think absolutely yes. Let's say I'll give you an example. One of the flagship EU projects, it's called Horizon Europe, which is our flagship research and innovation, let's say, project. And initially, it was created only to kind of connect the research and innovation community within Europe, and it's a relatively sizable, big project. So it's a significant investment from the EU into R&D ecosystem. This Horizon project has been expanding. I think Singapore is currently in negotiation to become a member in it. South Korea recently became a member in it. So Europe is showing, there are positive signs, and this is one that, we are opening up our flagship research and innovation project to universities in Singapore, to universities in South Korea, enabling then a collaboration among our scientists. So this is just one small sign, but it's a step in a good direction.
Mm.
So I hope more such projects can happen at a personal level. I frequently have students who come to me, sometimes bachelor students, and they ask me, Dean, what do you think? Where should I spend an exchange semester? Because we really, as a Zagreb School of Economics and Management, we really encourage them to spend at least half a year or 1 year somewhere abroad, because we believe it's good for them in many ways, not just learning a new language, but becoming more independent, prepares them better for entrepreneurship. So what I tell my students is, look, maybe one semester you can spend somewhere else in Europe. You go to Italy, you go to France, Germany, but certainly one semester go to Asia, go to Singapore, go to China, go to, I don't know, Japan. And even those projects, even those exchange programs can be supported by the Erasmus program, which I told you earlier about, because we have, for instance, signed Erasmus bilateral agreement with the university in Singapore, with the university in China. So when our students go there, they get financial support. Now, if we can do something at a EU Singapore, let's say, or EU China level, where there is a much more concentrated effort to support this student exchange, I think that would be a good sign in the right direction.
Where do you see Europe in this new multipolar world? Is it going to be a kind of new Europe where it's much more open, much more autonomous with its complexity?
The new multipolar world, every kind of challenging situation in life, whether at the personal level or at the national level, can be a challenge, but also it could be an opportunity. So let's say, yes, currently Europe is facing many challenges. We are in the process of redefining our relationship with our partners in the US. And also, as we talked about, we're calibrating our relationship with China. I am hopeful, and I hope that Europe will be able to find its own kind of European way that will enable us to, keep up collaborating with the America, keep up collaboration with China, but where we will have a much more clearly defined European interest, which, as we discussed earlier, was sometimes, over the last few years, sometimes, as a European, you're watching some things and you're like, oh, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Why are we doing this to ourselves? So this is my big hope, is that the some kind of a strategic autonomy will result from this, new multipolar world. The issue with Europe, Europe is still a kind of a place. I think Henry Kissinger once said it. If I need to call Europe, I don't know who do I call. Do I call Berlin, London, Paris? What is Europe? But this is exactly why we need in Europe, why we need the European Union. Why it's good that we have these bodies like the European Commission, because it can coordinate policies among the European countries much better. So my hope is that we'll emerge from this as a stronger, much more strategically autonomous Europe.
Yeah.
Focused on our own interests and working with our partners,
What should ASEAN learn from Europe?
I'm not really sure I'm in a position to say you should learn anything because, there was the reason why ASEAN was created and the reason why European Union was created are two different reasons, right?
Yeah.
So maybe for ASEAN, certain elements of the European Union, such as, free movement of people, is out of question. And I fully understand why this is the case. Imagine if Singapore was now, had open borders, then tomorrow you'd have like 20 million people living here. So it's not really realistic that you have something like an ASEAN Schengen. But for instance, again, one of the favorite parts of, let's say, one of my favorite European policies is the Erasmus policy, where at the kind of a European level, there has been an effort to create this financial support for students to actually spend part of their lives in a different EU country, and this creates, this helps create a European identity. Maybe this is something that
Yeah.
ASEAN could look into, like create a kind of an ASEAN type of
Identity.
Erasmus, so that young Singaporean students would go and spend a semester somewhere. But I mean, I understand that Singaporeans would probably just want to go and study in the UK or in the US.
Yeah, but we should spend more time in ASEAN.
Yeah, but you should spend more time. ASEAN is your neighborhood. You should try to understand it better. So something like Erasmus for ASEAN, I think, would be a pretty cool thing.
Okay.
What do you think?
I actually think that's a good idea. I
Yeah?
really think we should do more of that. I think there can be a case to be made that
Yeah.
you have an exchange semester there
Mm.
and it's sponsored by the state.
And obviously, what you could another thing is obviously the free trade. Europe is the single one of the it's a single market. It's one of the biggest single markets, in fact, in the world. So, kind of a free trade. This ASEAN is already kind of trying to facilitate. Yeah.
Last question: what's one piece of advice you would give to a graduating student entering in the working world, given what you know?
I'll tell you what I tell them, not when they graduate. I tell you what I tell them before they, on the first day of their universities. I tell them, look, the world is changing fast. You need to understand it as best as you can, and the way to do it is to maximally take advantage of all the opportunities that they have in front of them, and especially these opportunities of these Erasmus programs. And I tell them to go to study abroad, to spend a semester in Europe. I tell them to go to Asia to try to understand China better, to try to understand ASEAN better, Southeast Asia. This is something that I really tell them. I tell them to move out of their comfort zones and not just stay in one place. So these would be some of the key pieces of advice that I share with them.
Get out of your comfort zone.
Get out of your comfort zone. Move. Go to Asia. Spend time in China. Try to learn the language. Yeah, because ultimately, I mean, my institution, we are not kind of, but we are trying to create the future leaders of Croatia and the neighboring countries. People who will be taking on, high level roles in business, in politics, and it is exactly those. We were talking about what kind of leaders Europe needs. Europe needs a leader that can go to China and not, embarrass himself in a way, but still adequately represent our interest, which is possible, right? It's possible to fight for Europe while at the same time being, in a way, showing an understanding of a different country. So this is the type of leaders I want to create. And this is why I tell my students, you need to go there. Because, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to understand, let's say, this part of the world, understand Southeast Asia, understand Singapore, understand China, just from, being in Europe and reading and doing reading The Economist or Financial Times. You don't really get the right picture of what this place is really like. So I tell my students, look, you need to actually go there. You need to meet the people. You need to see the situation with your own eyes, see how it is on the ground. And this is why I really push them to get out of their comfort zones. And hopefully this is the type of leaders that Europe, as I said, that Europe will need.
Well, on that hopeful note, Dean, I need to thank you for dressing up and thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you are watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications for whenever new episodes are out. If you're on Spotify or Apple, it would help us greatly if you could leave a 5-star review on those platforms. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the Front Row Podcast.